Hello, everyone. Good evening and welcome. My name is Lauren Young, and I'm a Curatorial Assistant at the Whitney. As we begin, I would like to share that this event is being live captioned by Morgan Pate with Sign Nexus. You can enable these captions by clicking the CC button in Zoom at the bottom of your screen. It is my pleasure to welcome you to this evening's edition of Ask a Curator. The Ask a Curator programs allow you to hear from our curators about their experience organizing their exhibitions and offer an opportunity for you to ask your own questions about the art, artists, and ideas behind the show. Tonight's event is being recorded and will be posted to our YouTube channel if you would like to rewatch or share. At this time, I would like to introduce tonight's speaker, Scott Rothkopf, Senior Deputy Director and Nancy and Steve Crown Family Chief Curator at the Whitney and co-curator of Jasper Johns' Mind Mirror, which opened in September. Appearing simultaneously at the Whitney and at the Philadelphia Museum of Art through February 2022, Jasper Johns' Mind Mirror is the most comprehensive retrospective ever devoted to the artist's work. Scott will give an overview of the exhibition, and I will be back at the end to moderate a Q&A. If you have any questions, you can submit them using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen, and we will try to answer as many as we can. Now, I would like to turn it over to Scott for a review of Jasper Johns' Mind Mirror. Thank you, everyone.
Hello, everyone. Good evening if you're tuning in from a time zone close to mine, or good afternoon if you're further away, or good morning. Thank you, Lauren, for your introduction. But more than that, thank you for all your incredible work on this show. You were a terrific collaborator, as was Carlos Basualdo, my co-curator at the Philadelphia Museum of Art, and his curatorial assistant there, Sarah Vogelman. So I want to acknowledge this as being a true collaboration between two institutions and for people. I am going to move rather quickly through 70 years of art history plus a big exhibition in order to leave time for questions as promised at the end, so that this series can live up to its title of Ask a Curator rather than listen to a curator ramble. But I do want to set the stage a little bit by giving you a sense of some of the kind of key ideas in Johns's early work, as well as a sort of overview of the exhibition, at least as it exists at the Whitney. We couldn't do both shows at the same time, or both halves of the same show at the same time, because we are sort of limited in the amount of time we have together. But I'm going to try to breeze through this and then leave time for conversation. So this slide is one that I really like to start with because it sort of sets the stage in my mind for the kind of incredible arc of history that this exhibition covers. You see Jasper Johns on the left in 1955 in a photograph taken by none other than the artist Robert Rauschenberg with his first big flag, which is now on view at the PMA, often on view at MoMA. And then you see him on the right in his studio in Connecticut, in Sharon, a little closer to our own time in 2018. And just the idea that this is an artist who's been making work for almost 70 years. He's 91 years old, and we originally thought this show would celebrate his 90th birthday, and the pandemic made us postponed by a year, but we're happy to celebrate 91. Why not? Any year is worth celebrating at this stage in the life of such an august living legend. And really, Johns has been a living legend for a long time. You can see the cover of Newsweek magazine declaring him a super artist in 1977 on the occasion of, in fact, his previous Whitney retrospective in our old Breuer building uptown, and just other moments of this artist in, a certain amount of glory. He was a really famous figure from almost the very beginning of his career, and he's continued to be. And the challenge of working and making new art in the kind of context of your own fame and market and the shadow that you might almost cast in front of you as you're walking down the street is interesting. And it's something that I think Johns has set an incredible example of dealing with by constantly reinventing himself, staying so true to his art, staying focused on his work. And it's a real sort of testament to that staying power. Just a tiny bit of biography. You see Johns as a little boy in South Carolina, where he grew up. He was born in Georgia and grew up in South Carolina, shuttled between different family members as he was growing up, didn't have the happiest of childhoods, but spent time with his grandfather and step-grandmother in the house you see at the center of this slide, and then eventually went into the Army. It was drafted, of course, and finally made his way to New York in the mid-50s, where he met Robert Rauschenberg and began a very important artistic and also romantic relationship that would change the course, not just of his art, but I would say of art history. He became friends with a lot of other important creative individuals at that time, like the composer John Cage and the choreographer and dancer Merce Cunningham, who you see in the slide and the image on the right. And actually those four artists began an incredibly close and long collaboration, both in literal terms, works they made together, but also a kind of creative conversation that crossed over these different mediums and their disciplines. If you had kind of looked around New York in 1954, the year that Johns made the flag, you would have seen a variety of approaches to art making. A figurative tradition was certainly still alive and well in the work of an artist like Grace Hartigan or de Kooning, although a more abstract figure, of course, on the left. And there also would have been variety of abstractions, approaches to abstraction that you would recognize, of course, from the abstract expressionists like Rothko, the sublime color sensibility on the left of this slide. And then on the right, Rauschenberg, who was also working abstractly, but had a more impure approach, maybe this use of a vulgar found material like a green and yellow polka dot, a paint that's a little bit messier and not applied with the same delicacy and care. And that idea of the everyday world and of everyday materials was one of the important things that Johns really learned from Rauschenberg. If you'd come to a biennial in the mid-1950s, you would have seen a whole range of approaches to art making. And these are all works from the Whitney's collection. You see Charles Alston, you see, of course, Joseph Albers, and so many more. And I like to show this slide because it gives you a sense of a truer story of art history, I think, at this time than that narrative that says, oh, there was abstract expressionism, and then there was Jasper Johns, and then there was pop. There were a lot of different things going on. And it was against this backdrop that the flag sort of landed. And it feels to me almost like The Boy Who Fell to Earth, how brave and radical this gesture was. And what made it so disturbing to people at the time really was two things, I would say, if you had to summarize. One was that this flag and other works using everyday symbols like targets and maps and numbers felt so banal and quotidian as a subject. It wasn't really almost worth putting in art. It felt like it was also treated in a very unartistic way, like a ready-made. Johns's works at this time were compared to this idea of neo-Dada, of the ready-mades of Duchamp, even though, of course, the Johns painting was certainly much more made. But this was thought not to be an appropriate subject or an appropriate way of making a painting at this time. And it created a kind of succès de scandale. People were furious, some of them, but also celebrated Johns as early as 1958, when he first had his solo show at the Leo Castelli Gallery. If you get in close on these pictures, you can see the kind of incredible care that he put into the surface of these collaged works, which involve newspaper clippings, sometimes fabric, and an inventive but ancient technique of painting called encaustic, where Johns was able to work on a hot plate with melted wax that had kind of pigment mixed in it and apply that directly to the surface along with his collage elements. So this gave the painting a very tactile quality, an almost sculptural sense of relief that he was quite interested in, and was very different than the kind of slow drying oil paint. When you paint wet into wet and the colors mush around, you have to think about this almost like candle wax that's hardening as it melts and leaving the trace of the artist's work and labor and touch quite visible on the surface of the picture. I mentioned some of these other things the mind already knows. Johns's phrase for images that you could picture if you closed your eyes, like a target or the number 4. Johns also was interested at this time really in exploring the relationship between painting and sculpture, and the idea of a painting as something that exists in the room, that might be handled, that breaks through that two-dimensional canvas and engages the space around it. Language became an important quality that he wanted to explore, and in particular, the imbrication of language in the pictorial field. How do visual ideas about art and written or even spoken or heard ones kind of commingle in the same surface, maybe exploring the difference between, let's say, drawing and writing, or looking at a painting and reading a painting. What are those different perceptual acts and creative ones, and how do mixing them together force us to be quite aware and self-conscious of our relationship to the painting that we see? Sculpture also was quite important at this time in the early 60s for Johns, and you see the remarkable Savarin can, which is really just a kind of trompe-l'oeil, a doppelganger, a decoy, a perfect copy of the artist's tools in his studio, the brushes and the can in which he might clean his brushes. That was a coffee can. And in person, I hope you'll see in our galleries, it looks just like the real thing, but of course is actually a cast bronze. It's painted to look just like the real thing. It becomes a kind of symbol of the artist, a sort of depiction or self-portrait even of the artist through the tools of his trade. I mentioned that show in 1958 at Leo Castelli Gallery. Here's what it looked like. And it launched Johns immediately into a kind of great renown. He was on the cover of Art News. MoMA bought paintings, as did other important collectors and artists a bit younger than Johns. Remember this magazine arriving almost like a message in a bottle. You know, Ed Ruscha talks about how seeing this article sort of changed his sense of what art could be. Johns has had a very important relationship since the beginning of his career with both the Whitney and the Philadelphia Museum of Art. And I want to segue away from talking about some of the key ideas in his early work to this history. He is one of the only people alive that I know, actually I know 3, who can recall visiting all 4 Whitney museums. The first being on 8th Street, which he visited as a teenager, where he first saw the work of Jackson Pollock in the 1940s. Johns and the Whitney were actually born the same year in 1930. And he is exhibited at the next 3 of those museums on 54th Street, on Madison Avenue, and of course, our current home on Gansevoort Street. And in Philadelphia, Johns also has a rich history that dates back to the 1950s, which I'll explore in a minute. We have over 200 works in our permanent collection, as you can see here, and he's been in many exhibitions, and the show really draws on this history, which is not really just about objects, but about shared expertise and interest and attention and care for works. Over the years, our art handlers have become so skilled, they have a kind of muscle memory in installing the works. Our head of conservation has spent hours talking with Johns about his medium, and it's interesting to think that the work of a curator of a museum is so much more than just assembling objects, but studying them and caring for them, not just over the few years of making the show, or in our case, 5.5 years, but even decades. You see Johns across those decades at various Whitney events, that 77 retrospective I mentioned in the Breuer building, right at the center, as well as with artists like Roy Lichtenstein, Jim Rosenquist, Rauschenberg, of course, and there's Warhol standing in front of the Whitney's own 3 flags. Here's some pictures from that 77 show when Michael Crichton actually wrote the catalog essay for the exhibition. And quite famously in 1980, the 3 flags ended up on the cover of the New York Times when the Whitney acquired it for the then unheard of sum of $1 million, the largest amount was thought ever to have been paid for the work of a living American artist. In Philadelphia, that history began in the late 50s when, as I mentioned, Johns's work was compared to Duchamp's, and Johns and Rauschenberg didn't really know that much about Duchamp. So they made a pilgrimage to see the remarkable holdings of the Ahrensburg collection at Philadelphia, where you can see so many iconic Duchamp works like the large glass. And Johns returned over the years to see Duchamp's posthumously unveiled masterpiece, the Étant Donné. He had a long and close relationship with the museum's former director, Anne Darnencourt, who you see at the top left of the screen. He represented the US in the Venice Biennale under the aegis of the Philadelphia Museum of Art, and more recently was the subject of a wonderful exhibition curated by my colleague, Carlos Basualdo, exploring this connection between his work as well as Cunningham's, Cage's, Rauschenberg's, and Duchamp's. I'm going to pause and take a breath. Our exhibition came about 5.5 years ago, as I mentioned, as a kind of almost happy coincidence that both Carlos and I and our museum's directors were interested in pursuing an exhibition of Johns's, the first large-scale retrospective on the East Coast since the show that was held at MoMA now 25 years ago. And we realized at some point that it really wasn't going to make sense to do the standard way that we co-organize a show, which is that it starts at one venue and it travels to a second, because the works were too difficult to get these loans for such a long period of time. They were fragile. The insurance was going to be an issue. And also we were so close to one another that we hoped that people might be able to kind of experience the show in both places. And so why make it the same show twice? And it was Carlos who had the wonderful idea that we ought to try something perhaps unprecedented, which was to explore Johns's career, these 70 years, over what would become 500 works between the two sites at the same time. So the show opened to the public on September 29th, and it closes February 13th at both museums on the same day, in fact. And we had to think long and hard about how we would structure the relationship between the two venues. Would we do early works in one place and late in the other? Would we do works on paper over here and paintings and sculptures over there, which didn't really make a lot of sense to us because we wanted the show to function in a way if one only saw it at a single venue. We imagine that not everyone will be able to make this trip, this pilgrimage, although we hope everyone will. And so it's important that each exhibition have integrity from start to finish at each venue and feel like a complete and whole experience. But then if you saw the two, the sum would be greater than its parts. And ultimately, the idea for the organizing principle of the exhibition came from Johns's work itself, which was his long-standing preoccupation and use of mirroring and doubling throughout his career. And you see a few examples of that, such as the work at the top center, Corpse and Mirror, which is bilaterally symmetrical. The painting literally reflects itself across that central scene. You see the two ale cans, which are imperfect copies of one another in the same sculpture, works that play with doubling, like the flags, or works that exist in pairs, like the black and white and colored paintings that you see on the bottom left. That also exists in paintings that are made in an encaustic or an oil, let's say. And we understood that we could create a show that had an echo effect between the two sites, a kind of sense of mirroring or doubling as a way of thinking about the whole. The way we did this was to come up with 10 ideas that we wanted to explore, each with 2 examples that were distinct from one another, one example or one gallery of examples in each city. So here's a little preview of that. You can see these 10 ideas articulated here. The Whitney has 3 extra galleries, only because we had a little more space. But we wanted to think about the early motifs that Johns used in the 50s and 60s. And so at the Whitney, you'll see flags and maps, and in Philadelphia, you'll see numbers. You'll also see a little bit of each of those in the other place too, but the galleries are primarily organized in that way. We wanted to remake an exhibition that Johns himself installed at the Leo Castelli Gallery in the 1960s. If you visit Philadelphia, you'll see an incredible show he made in 1960. If you visit the Whitney, you'll see a show from 1968. So at either venue, you'll get the same 10 methodologies or concepts, but illustrated with a totally different set of examples. At the Whitney, you arrive to this wall of prints, which we also, of course, show at Philadelphia. And it's a kind of timeline of the artist's work, or the artist's work in prints at least, from the early 1960s to 2021, the most recent work in the show, which you see in a very small square on the very far right of this incredible timeline of his graphic works. We wanted this sense of an opening that felt full of surprise and was to some degree, I would say, anti-heroic. We have a tradition at the Whitney of having a kind of shock and awe moment with a big painting, the biggest Julie Meritou, the biggest Andy Warhol, and that often sets the stage. But it felt important to jostle a little bit this idea of Johns as this icon or this hero who's so well known, and perhaps a way into his work that would surprise people would be both through the work on paper, because that's such an important part of his practice, even if often museums or the market have a kind of hierarchy between, let's say, paintings and drawings and prints, which is not a hierarchy that Johns in any way subscribes to. But also that you would get this sense of a kind of coming attraction for the movie that the show would be, this multiplicity of motifs that he's explored throughout his career, some that are quite well known, like the flags and maps and targets, but others that might feel very surprising to a visitor at first glance. We did not take for granted that the people who come to this show, at the Whitney in particular, we have a young audience. They don't know Johns's work necessarily, or they might think of him as this artist from a history book, from a postcard, or something you could buy in a museum shop. And really, we wanted to make this work feel alive. This is the work of a living artist. It's full of risk and curiosity and discovery. And how could we present this body of work at both museums in a way to restore to it, to some degree, this vivid sense of Johns making it and bringing certain ideas and even emotions to the surface. Speaking of emotions, when you go into the first gallery, it's really a kind of somber exploration of ideas as to how Johns was trying to make a space for himself apart from, let's say, abstract expressionism. And the standard narrative about that is that those artists were exploring their feelings and being very inventive, and Johns, to some degree, turned to more ready-made images as a way of not telling so much about himself or being so inventive in terms of creating new imagery. And I've never found that explanation wholly satisfying, because to me, there was in fact a deep expression in that anti-expressivity, that there's an emotional landscape to be explored through that act of withholding, of disappearing, of negating. You see a painting on the left that says the word no. Johns did not make a painting, to my knowledge, that said yes. You see Tennyson on the right covered over with a canvas. What's hiding behind that painting, or the painting voice? It's hard to see here, with the word voice stenciled on the surface and then being wiped out or almost silenced. You see targets that become somewhat useless as the device that they are made to be, which is something that focuses eyesight. It's something you aim at. And in the middle, of course, there's a target that plays with some notion of the loss of sight, these faces that don't have eyes, or targets that are white or gray, the concentric circles having disappeared and kind of been evacuated in a way of the function and the standard way we think of a target. There are also in this gallery works made in 1961, which felt important to explore, because that was the year that Johns and Rauschenberg went through the kind of final breakup, if you will, of their relationship. Rauschenberg was such a key influence on Johns. Johns described him as the first artist he ever really met, the first real artist, I should say. And in 1961, he made some of the most despairing, lonely, sometimes angry paintings of his career, like Liar, which has a sense of accusation, or Painting Bitten by a Man, which is both perhaps erotic and also violent. We're just moving right along. The next gallery at the Whitney is one that sort of juxtaposes these iconic flags and maps in both color and black and white. And the idea here was to think about how two of the most prevalent early motifs in Johns' career, flags and maps, might pressure and kind of, pressure one another in opening up thinking about the United States. And we divided the gallery into color and black and white, perhaps to suggest the sort of difference between a more jubilant, optimistic sense of the country, perhaps a patriotic one, a place that's full of promise, and then also a country that maybe doesn't live up to those ideals, that is a dark force, perhaps in relation to other countries at times, or even its own citizens, depending on who is looking at these paintings. This notion of the flag as a kind of almost toxic or inside out symbol comes to have real political resonance when we look at a poster like the Moratorium work on the right, which was made as part of an anti-Vietnam War effort. These works of the 50s and 60s were made at a complicated time in American history during the Civil Rights Movement, the Cold War, the Vietnam War, and part of what makes those works so powerful is how open they were to people's projection about their circumstances and feelings in relation to this nation. The next gallery, which is one of two galleries that explores places that Johns has lived and worked. At the Whitney, you have South Carolina, and in Philadelphia, you have an incredible gallery about Japan, where he went during the army and then repeatedly thereafter. And at the Whitney, we thought about South Carolina through a kind of two lenses. One, works he made there in 1961 or the early and mid 60s when he bought a house at Edisto Beach and kind of went there as a refuge and made works like Studio from the Whitney's collection that referenced this place quite specifically. You see the screen door, which evokes the sense of a breeze through the studio, certainly not the kind of thing associated with an apartment in New York. The palm leaf or palmetto frond that's pressed onto the surface of the canvas, a kind of tree that would have grown in the area around his studio. The cans that he would use to mix the paint, and even the brush with which he might make a painting, hanging off the right edge of this painting, make it really an allegory about the act of creation, the place where the painting is made, the tools with which one makes it, and the painting itself. And you get a sense of an opening up of the brushwork, the scale that maybe evokes the sea or the sky in its gray and blue palette. Here you can see that studio, which actually tragically burned down in 1966. And Johns was away, but that sense of loss haunted him in thinking about the beach, even during the time that the studio stood. You see an image on the left of a sculpture dedicated to his friend, the poet Frank O'Hara. That's Frank O'Hara's foot that would be pressed into Edisto Beach sand. And it works like the print pinion at the center, which has a very kind of aqueous looking surface, a watery surface, the way he thought of the lithographic stone as a place that might almost capture or conjure the sense of the tide rolling in over these impressions of a foot, a hand. At the top, it's hard to see in this image, is a detail of a painting called Eddingsville, another town in South Carolina, which actually has beach trash affixed to it. So you're seeing beach trash with this spectrum. The second part of the South Carolina gallery also reflects on that place, but now in later work, primarily from the 90s and the 2000s, where John is developing a vocabulary of iconography based on his memories of his childhood, including the image you see on the left, which is actually the floor plan of his grandfather's house, created from memory, where he was raised. You saw that picture at the beginning of the talk. In the print on the right, you might notice a small family photograph of his grandparents' family and his father. There are other works that reference a Chinese costume, a Chinese Halloween costume he remembers wearing as a boy in the 1930s, and how all those images kind of sort of commingle in the space of his memory and his mind as now an older man was something we wanted to explore. At each venue, we have a gallery that focuses on a single major work. At the Whitney, it's According to What from 1964. In Philadelphia, it's Untitled from 1972. And what we wanted to think about in this gallery was how Johns has occasionally in his career made a painting that was both a synthesis of the ideas that he'd explored up until that point, as well as a springboard for future works. So this idea of something that's an anthology and also generative is really important in Johns's art. And so this painting, According to What, is a kind of incredible homage to Duchamp. And we don't really have time, if you're going to ask questions, to get into all the details of the painting, but really thinking about that notion that I mentioned at the beginning of exploring different modes of representation and perception is a kind of key to this work, how language, different sign systems, if we think about colors that are both made and mixed by the artist, or feel more prefabricated, how a sculptural element like the hanger and the chair at the top left could coexist in a flat painting. Is it a painting or is it a sculpture? Is it some hybrid of the two? We see works in the galleries that precede or just about correspond to that painting in time, and also works on the other side of the gallery that post-date it, often by quite a few years. The drawing on the left, when people first see it, they assume it's a study for the painting, and it turns out to have been made around 5 years later. And the prints actually are from 1971, all focusing on individual details of that large painting, translating the sculptural elements of it into 2 dimensions, into graphic form. How Johns would return again and again to motifs and to works of art as a sort of endless font of new ideas. And it's a sort of motor to his art, is this very, not repetitive, but recursive practice. I mentioned that we would recreate at the Whitney and in Philadelphia 2 exhibitions, one from 1960 and one from 1968. And here you see views of that 68 show at the Leo Castelli Gallery at 4 East 77th Street in Manhattan on the Upper East Side. It was really interesting to spend time thinking about the scale of that space, which was actually quite small compared to contemporary galleries that we see today, and also big museum spaces like the Whitney. And we wanted to actually recreate physically the space of the gallery exactly as it was. So you see here, or almost exactly, we didn't do the floor or drop the ceiling, a picture from 68 and how that gallery looks today. We were able to borrow all of the paintings from that show. We hung them at the actual heights that they were hung, 12 to 14 inches off the floor, which is pretty low by our standards. And we dropped a datum, a painted line around the top that would suggest the actual height of the ceiling. It was really interesting in piecing this gallery together to think about Johns making a body of work that was made to be shown together. What would that feel like? What was the scale of a large painting like Harlem Light on the right here in relation to the size of the wall? It actually fills the wall pretty well. Looks funny in this perspective. How he approached making paintings that had an integral relationship to one another and also to the space in which they were shown. We thought a lot about printmaking, not just in relation to the edition prints with which we opened the show, but also the unique prints that Johns has made throughout his career. At Philadelphia, you see the so-called working and trial proofs, which Johns used to often make the color selections and develop an image in his printmaking, or sometimes draw on top of those images after the fact. And he has actually saved and signed more than 1,000 of these works. So he doesn't see them as things that might be destroyed or studies along the way, but things that could be shown on their own. And then at the Whitney, we explore this almost, it sounds like an oxymoron, the idea of a unique print through the monotype, which is really just a print made from a plate that doesn't have an image etched or sort of stuck onto the surface, carved in it. It's a plate that an artist draws or paints directly on, and after you print it, the image begins to disappear. We chose to focus on this beautiful series of Savarin prints that are actually from the Whitney's collection in relation to the iconic sculpture that I mentioned at the beginning of the talk. The notion here was to really let you into Johns's creative process, the experimentation, the freedom of the print shop, which is collaborative, which is open to chance, which is a kind of faster way of working often than a painting. It's much easier to change the color of a print than that of a painting. And you could feel almost Johns's kind of creative juices flowing as you looked at these works. There's something kind of cinematic about them, like opening up a film strip and seeing the frame change subtly from, the image change subtly from one frame to the next. So we made these dark walls and lit the pictures and hung them like a frieze. So you're literally encircled with this story of the development of this image. You can see some of the way that he was playing with the plate, with his handprints directly on the surface of it, almost conflating that signature mark of the crosshatch with the signature mark of one's handprint. Next, we have a gallery that really sort of puts a fine point on this question of, or idea of, the mirror or the double. It was important that, although this was not the theme of the show as a whole, as I said, it was the organizing principle of the relationship of the two parts, that we wanted to show where this idea came from at both venues. So we made a gallery exploring mirroring and doubling as a question per se. And one of the sort of exciting breakthroughs, I think, from our exhibition design team and the conversations we were having was to think about showing pairs of paintings not side by side, as we often see them in an art history class, you know, the two slide projectors that they used to be are now the two cut and paste PowerPoint images, but actually to present these pairs of works at 90-degree angles to one another in corners in the room, or in this kind of kaleidoscopic viewing device that you see at the center of this large gallery at the Whitney. And it was really an interesting way of thinking about it, because if you imagine two paintings hanging side by side, they don't really see each other. They don't really act on each other. But once they're put at an angle to one another, there's some sense of a pressure or a dialogue between them that's rather different. If you think of maybe opening a medicine cabinet and seeing the mirror kind of changing the room, or looking out the side view mirror in a car while you're driving. We wanted you to enter a space that felt uncanny and really brought to life the kind of complexity of Johns's thinking across paintings in pairs, or sometimes that same painting just down its middle. So here are these two paintings, Mirror's Edge, which are in oil and encaustic, but also have this upside down compositional variation. You see, looking across the room, some paintings that are symmetrical, like Device from the Dallas Museum, reflected actually in the mirror lining of the wall. That was a big debate. I can share a kind of go big or go home moment where we were like, is this too much? Are we gonna go over the top here? Or is it something that will actually sort of, you know, help people see this experience that we're trying to create, help people actually feel it viscerally, even if they didn't read the writing on the wall. At the center of both galleries in Philadelphia and at the Whitney, we have the Ballantine ale cans, which interestingly is a sculpture that exists actually in an edition of two, that it contains two imperfect copies of one another, which are themselves imperfect copies of an endless stream of copies, those mass-produced beer cans that Johns knew so well. It's a really interesting and important work, of course, precedes Warhol's Brillo boxes, via Selman's painted erasers, or Jeff Koons's inflatables. And we can see how it opens the way for artists to think about these sculptures that both sort of ape or copy the products of industry, and at the same time have some residue of the artist's hand, which is both a sort of almost sad idea as an artist tries to negotiate their place in this world of consumer objects and what is the relationship between them, and artworks that selves were becoming commodified, but also kind of, touching and hopeful, and the artist still exercising their capacity to create the kind of magic of mimesis or copying something from the world. Here's a few more views across this gallery, including the wonderful pair of paintings in black and white and color called Racing Thoughts. And one of the really fun and interesting things about this gallery to me is that it always feels like it's changing depending on where you're standing and what view you sort of get of these different works. I'm going to not talk about these paintings. I do want to leave time for questions. We are nearing the end. At the Whitney, we have a gallery exploring dreams. And in Philadelphia, we call that gallery Nightmares. And really what we were thinking about was the quality of reverie and the kind of free and imaginative and surreal work that comes out of Johns's mind in the 1980s and 90s. There's a kind of unlatching or opening of a door, it feels, in his brain that allows in so many new images from art history, whether it's Picasso or references to Magritte, and also to his own life, his bathroom in Stony Point, New York, which you see on the right with the Picasso, or a reference to his grandmother, Montez, or his step-grandmother in the painting Montez Singing, with the little sailboat at the center, which was a reference to a song she sang called Red Sails at Sunset. And you see the paintings almost in this kind of active flow from one to the next, the eyes from the Picasso image on the right sort of migrating to the painting Montez Singing. So that it becomes almost a face looking in on itself, that painting, a portrait perhaps of Johns's step-grandmother, or also an image of a landscape. If you see the mouth as a mountain, the one of the eyes could be a sun, and that nose or mouth figure as a cloud. The gallery has a really beautiful sense of, I think, play and a kind of celestial atmosphere, and the curving walls and the pale blue paint that we chose, which creates a very beautiful backdrop for this gathering of works on paper. We were so lucky to be able to borrow from Johns himself many images that had never been shown before, like these watercolors that you see here, not a medium that he's so associated with, but a place of interesting experimentation at this time as he brought these new images into his work. When you arrive on the west side of the building, you enter a pretty glorious space, all bathed in natural light. You can see our new neighbor, the little island, high little island across the way, and the Google Pier just behind it. But you really see a group of recent sculptures by Johns from the early 2000s, the aughts, as I think I'm supposed to call them, that look back to the number sequence that he developed early in his career, and also to a specific painting that some of you may know from the Koch Theater at Lincoln Center, a work that was commissioned by Philip Johnson in 1964. And you see a version of that hanging on the back wall in aluminum. He explored the kind of incredible opportunities he got with the casting process in various metals, silver, bronze, copper, aluminum, and also the quality of how those metals take the light so differently. Here you see an image closer to sunset, which really lets you experience that feeling of Johns's interest in the capacity of the medium to resonate almost literally with the viewer. And the final two galleries explore a sense of mortality in Johns's work. Now we're looking at work of an artist made in his 70s and even his 80s, as he's thinking quite directly about getting older or facing perhaps the end of life. That was a preoccupation of many of the early works, but something that I think gets stronger as he gets older. You see this trio of drawings that evoke an almost funereal atmosphere with a shroud, a cross, and an urn on a pedestal, which feels like a monument to me. You see works where the little boy that appeared in the 1980s in works like The Seasons now returns in a haunted, almost lonely environment. You know, the hollow of his chest filled with this figure of a woman in extremis or distress from Picasso. You see images of a grieving Marine, Lieutenant Farley, who lost his comrade during the Vietnam War, broken down in despair and grief, and treated in this beautiful work on plastic, almost like a stained glass window. You see other versions of that image, as well as a skeleton motif that comes at a really difficult time in Johns's life when he experienced a kind of betrayal from a studio assistant who stole works that were unfinished and sold them. And then those works were returned, some of them from the FBI. And Johns took an unfinished work that had his own shadow at the center of it and emblazoned that with a skeleton like an X-ray. Here to end my part of the talk, I want to reflect back again on the span of this artist's life and work. You see him in New York City on Riverside Drive in a wonderful portrait by Avedon, smiling. Yes, he has a great smile and a good laugh in 1965. And then again, a more recent picture that really reminds me of the story of this artist's life and also his work. And before I open up to questions, I want to give a plug to our catalog. So if you haven't ordered already, I hope you do. It is a great, almost third site of the exhibition, the one place where you will find, in fact, Philadelphia and New York meeting together, because we were able to make a single book for the whole show, the two parts of it, with those 10 ideas down the spine and each of the two articulations of those ideas. So you have an idea like constellations, those paintings we unpacked, explored at the Whitney through According to What, which I shared with you, and related pictures from it in that gallery, almost like a visual essay. And then you have Untitled 72 from Philadelphia. So the whole book is structured with these paired thoughts. And I do encourage you to have a look at it. So with that, I do think we should open the floor to questions. And Lauren, am I supposed to stop sharing my screen, or are we going to just keep these images up?
That's actually a good question. I don't know, but before, keep something up.
Okay, so, I'll go back to this one. We can have a Philadelphia moment after all that Whitney talk.
Exactly. So we've gotten a lot of really great questions. I am going to try to, bring attention to the ones that there were a number of inquiries around. So a lot of people are interested in Jasper's involvement in the show. So if you could speak to how involved he was, choice of objects, catalog, installation.
Yeah, well, that's a great question, and I can answer it in an almost confusing way, is that he was both very involved and very little involved. And what I mean by that is that he was a great support and an abiding presence during the 5.5 years that we worked on this project. Carlos and I would visit him in Connecticut every 3 or 4 months, sometimes for a few days at a time, spend time in the studio, asking him questions about his new work, asking him questions about old works, looking at his archive. And he, as I mentioned, is the single, I'm not sure if I mentioned, but he is the single biggest lender to the show. So he couldn't have been more supportive of and curious and interested in the project. When I say very little involved, it's really because he respects, in a way that I have never experienced as a curator, the kind of fundamental distinction between the work of the artist and that of the curator. It's like a separation of church and state. He makes the work and we make the show. So he was not very directional in terms of saying, I want this in the show, I don't want that in the show, I like this idea or not that idea. On a few instances, he did make certain preferences known, but I would say they were few and far between, and that was extremely daunting on the one hand, because you weren't getting that kind of constant feedback that you often get from an artist who's alive, that I've had working with artists like Jeff Koons or Laura Owens or Glenn Ligon, but it was also liberating because we could really craft this show through our view of the work, which created something I think quite new.
I'm muting here and deciding on another question. A lot of people were also curious about the two-part structure, of course. And so one person asked, wanted to think more closely about the difference between the installations. And they said specifically that they'd seen both shows in 24 hours and that it was a fabulous experience. And, why Philadelphia seemed maybe more orderly and ours, it sort of threw people in the middle of it.
That's interesting. Yeah, I don't know that I would say orderly versus the middle, but I think that's an interesting comment. And by the way, whoever saw both parts of this show in 24 hours deserves a special prize. We should have like a giveaway or something for that, because it's a lot of art to look at. Oh, the lights just went out in the building, so I might have got a little darker. But we certainly, I think both shows have a different character in their installation based on the physical nature of the two places. The museums have really different architecture. At the Whitney, we have a kind of blank canvas. Our fifth floor, which is 18,000 square feet, is a completely open box. And so we did a super custom, almost bespoke build out of the space where every room was designed for the works that it would hold. And in Philadelphia, I think they were dealing with a bit more given spaces, but one of the things I love about the Philadelphia galleries is the low ceilings actually in the early work, where you get a sense of the scale of those pictures. And they were actually seen and originally exhibited in places that had much lower ceilings than the Whitney. So it kind of restores to those pieces a sense of scale that I think is really great. You know, what I should say about the making of the shows and the structure is that Carlos and I worked really side by side and hand in glove on the creation of the whole show. It really is the product of a collaboration, and it's one show in two parts. When we created those 10 ideas, or the 20 galleries, let's say the 2 rows of 10 ideas, there was a point at which, for practical reasons, we had to slightly divide and take a responsibility for each of our own venues. Editing the checklists and creating the exhibition designs with our team. And so maybe also the display reflects a little bit about the minds of the curators and their style at the level of installing art. And that would be an interesting study for someone else to make, but I'm not going to analyze myself on the screen.
Thank you. Getting to some more thematic questions, there was some interest in Johns's sexuality and specifically his relationship with Rauschenberg. So someone asked, what impact do you think Johns being gay had on his work? And how much did his breakup with Rauschenberg really affect him and his work?
Yeah, well, I think that's a very important, interesting question. And I'm not even maybe wanting to attach a particular term to his idea of his sexuality, which he hasn't ever labeled in quite that way. And as far as I know, although we all look forward to Deborah Solomon's biography, which will be published posthumously, which will have more information about this, he's had relationships in his life with both men and women. And so I think maybe that's a kind of complicated subject to some degree to put a label on. But I will say it was important for me and for Carlos to acknowledge that this was a romantic, a sexual relationship between Johns and Rauschenberg, that it wasn't something that was just a friendship. Often in exhibitions of his work, or even other artists like Twombly or Rauschenberg, there's a kind of maybe dancing around an issue like that felt to me not appropriate to the Whitney Museum in 2021. And the work that we were doing, the point of view of the institution, and hopefully the candor we could have around works like that and ideas like that. And so that group of works I mentioned from 1961, which I've interpreted, not just me, in relation to the breakup, as something we acknowledge in the wall label. We have a wonderful essay by my colleague, the curator Drew Sawyer, at the Brooklyn Museum in our catalog that really deals with the kind of queer historiography of Johns's work, how different artists have, not different artists, different art historians and critics over the years wrestled with this issue of whether to claim him as a queer artist or not. And so I felt that the most honest thing to do was to acknowledge the importance of that, some of these ideas in the show and in the book. And it's something I think that will continue to be studied as time goes on.
Thank you, Scott. There were also some questions about Johns's relationship to pop art and how you place him in that history and in the history of art. I mean, because he has had such a long career, he doesn't fit neatly into any one movement. And so someone also asked, how has Johns changed art in the history of art?
Well, those are two great questions, or maybe they're related. It's kind of, Johns has changed the history of art in a number of ways. And I think I'll start with that and we'll go to pop art. You know, he really, in his early work from the mid 1950s to the mid 1960s, lit so many fires for other artists that it's almost hard today to sometimes see how revolutionary his work was, because it was like superseded to some extent by the next set of ideas that were in such kind of close succession to his own thought. So you can take, for example, pop art, and you can look at a flag or the Ballantine ale cans and see that as a kind of gateway to the work of Warhol, of Lichtenstein, that kind of embrace of imagery from the everyday world, plainly painted in a flat kind of way. And although Johns himself said, I'm not a pop artist, certainly his work seems related to pop and has often been discussed that way. But that's only one example. You could look at the history of conceptual art that's based on an interest in language, in systems like numbers, and think about Johns's use of language or counting in his work. You could look at certain artists who took something from his sense of touch or materials, like Bryce Marden or Eva Hess at that period, or even later, Glenn Ligon, thinking about those beautiful stenciled oil stick paintings, and so many more. Even the ale cans, I mentioned Via Selmans and Jeff Koons, Fishley Advice, Robert Gober. How many different artists have played with that idea of a sculpture that is this kind of uncanny double of something from the world? So that's just 4 or 5 examples that all grew out of only 10 years worth of work. And there's so many more ways that we could think about the kind of Promethean aspect to this artist, this kind of lighting of fires. That is a phrase that the late curator Kirk Varnado used in talking about Johns 25 years ago in his MoMA catalog.
Thank you. I'm going to sort of shift gears and kind of go back to the making of the show. And someone wanted to know kind of about the logistics of putting the show together and, like, for instance, insuring the works. And they wanted you to discuss it more. And someone else had even asked, what was the most difficult work to obtain?
Well, that's a very good question. All those are good questions. This was a very logistically complicated show. I've done some logistically complicated shows in my career. The Jeff Koons show was highly logistically complicated due to the scale and the fragility of those works. So there was a lot of complications in that show around moving and setting up the objects, which is a little different, although these works are fragile, not quite in the same way. And what made it so complicated, of course, was having 2 venues and sorting through 500 works and this incredible puzzle of which things went where. And the lenders had to be along for the ride with us. If we asked to borrow something for Philadelphia and they said, oh, I want it to be in New York, well, we'd say, well, but the gallery about Japan is in Philadelphia, and vice versa. And some of the lenders actually were so generous to allow us to show things in both venues. So that was a real logistical challenge. The insurance, we were lucky and fortunate, thank you to the federal government, to get insurance indemnity that helps subsidize the insurance. We have a federal program that does that for big exhibitions that would be hard to insure otherwise, but obviously the market value of these works is very high. And when you do a show with such valuable works with an insurance indemnity, you have to think from the start about so many details, like even where the stanchions go, what are the light levels for the works that are on that insurance indemnity, how the works are glazed or not in terms of whether people could touch them. So we had more conversations about stanchions than I've ever had in my life, which was interesting to me because the whole creation of the show was a kind of piece. You didn't add the stanchions at the end. You had to know where they were going to go if they could fit between the walls that you had. And so there were many things like that. In terms of the hardest loan to get, I will say that there were 2 works from private collections in New York that came out of windows with cranes from apartments upstairs. And so that's always a nail biter, but we were really lucky that people allowed us to borrow those works. I think we may only have time for one more question, Lauren, because I see we're just up almost to 7.
Yes, I am trying to select one more. I mean, many people did have a simple question, which is, has Jasper Johns seen the show yet? And what does he think of it?
That is a good question. Jasper Johns has not seen the show yet. He had a bit of a fall, let's say, before the show opened, and he's doing well. I visited him with Carlos 2 weeks ago, and he's doing great and recovering and getting around, and he will come see the show, we are sure. But he wasn't able to make it to the opening for that reason. And he's been watching quite a few of the videos and things we've made. I don't know, Jasper, if you're watching tonight, hi, or you may be watching it on YouTube tomorrow and following the reviews and the pictures, and seems quite curious and interested in everything we've been up to. So maybe that's a good place to end the conversation. And I do want to end with well, first of all, a thank you to our digital and membership teams and to anyone who is on this screen who's a member. We're thrilled to have your support. And I want to make a PSA that on November 18th, the PMA in association with the Whitney are hosting a panel where various creatives will talk about the influence that Johns has had on their work. So that's something that will answer one of the questions that was asked, perhaps better than I was able to answer it. And on December 14th, we'll have our next Ask a Curator in our series of Ask a Curator videos with Jane Panetta talking about Jennifer Packer, whose gorgeous show is on view right now at the same time as Johns at the 8th floor at the museum. We also have My Barbarian on view. I hope you'll check that out. And please do, if you can, see the show in Philadelphia and at New York before they close on February 13th. So with that, it's 7 o'clock, and I want to thank you all for tuning in and for all your interest in Johns's work and the Whitney. And have a good night. Bye-bye.